They're going to be made up of the different macronutrients. So we've got our macronutrients, which are essentially nutrients that are going to be required in larger amounts within the diet. Okay, and the thing is that they provide the energy, calories, as Jack obviously mentioned earlier. We're going to use them relatively interchangeably. And from a macronutrient perspective, the main ones being protein, carbohydrates, and fat. Um, Protein is going to provide you with 4 calories per gram. So if you have, I'm just going to keep everything at 100 for the sake of this. If you have 100 grams of protein in a day, it would be 400 calories coming directly from protein. If you then had, we're just going to go with 100 for the sake of this, 100 calories, 100 grams of carbohydrate from 100 grams of carbohydrate per day, you're then going to have 400 calories coming from carbohydrates. And then you've had 800 calories for the day. If you have 100 grams of fat for the day, fat is 9 calories per gram, you'll have 900 calories coming directly from fat. So then what's that? 1,700 calories a day, due to the function, as a function of having 100, 100, and 100 protein, carbs, and fat. That's kind of like where the initial considerations around fat making you fat came from. The fact that it just has what 2.125 or something like that, times the amount of calories as any of the other macronutrients. But as we're going to discuss, fat is an essential nutrient that we need within our diet for various reasons. But before we get to fat, I think it's important that we discuss protein first. Protein. But we're here for physique development. We're gonna discuss protein first.
Yeah.
So,
Don't know if you put alcohol in there for macronutrients.
the thing is, the definition of a macronutrient is an essential nutrient within the diet.
Okay. Okay.
I made up my own mind that it's not an essential nutrient within the
Okay.
diet.
Some people might differ. Some people might argue with that.
Well, I'll tell you, I met a master of sports nutrition not too long ago, and I posed a question to him. I was
Was
like,
this
right,
about
come here, I want
hydration?
to.
Alcohol and
No,
hydration or something else?
it was literally just about alcohol as a macronutrient and how it
Okay,
fits
right.
into categorization of what is. See, it's considered a macronutrient obviously because it contains energy,
Yeah.
but when you look at the definition of a macronutrient, it says it has
Yeah.
to be essential. I'm like, what the hell are we doing? So yeah, he said no based on my definition, but I don't know. I think I gave him a new way of thinking about it too. To be honest with you, the way he kind of answered me. But yes, so alcohol contains calories, guys. Believe it
For
or not,
everyone out there that thinks there's no calories in alcohol, there is
like
calories in alcohol.
there's no calories in vodka. Did you ever get
Yeah,
that?
yeah, it's grand. This is grand. Oh, I was so funny. Just got like going out and like, let's say you're at a social event. Like if I'm on prep and I'm going to a social event, and people go, just have vodka. I'm like, no, like they really they still think to this day that it's like no calories. Like it just doesn't exist. It's like there's 7 calories per gram of alcohol. It's I don't know.
You
It's
just haven't
crazy.
got the carbohydrates and sugars which you'd have from obviously like a
Yeah.
beer or something like that. But so that's why it's generally lower in calories. But anyways, yeah, it counts. So you have to count it, and you have to add that to what Jack mentioned earlier about during them 14 days. You have to be honest with your alcohol consumption as well, because it will massively just pump up whatever you're having. I came up with an issue for each and every one of the macronutrients, right? So the one with protein is just generally that individuals tend not to consume enough protein. Would you agree? Is that something that you see from the very get go?
Yeah, obviously, it's very, very easy to consume or overconsume carbohydrates and fat or alcohol. So particularly obviously when it comes to breakfast and starting your day, and that's kind of where obviously people they get off on the wrong foot, and that's why they have to play catch up where they do not hit their protein target for the day. Is kind of having a very low protein
Yeah,
breakfast for the most part. That's what I see.
yeah, literally cereal in the morning, and then maybe like something weird at lunch. There's always something different weird at lunch someone will have. and then it might be like a relatively moderate to high protein dinner, and that's
Yeah.
about it for the day. That's generally what I tend to see. But anyways, from the perspective of physique development, protein is going to be ensuring that you've got your calories and protein is probably going to get you so far along that path towards where you're looking to go. Um, Literally from the point of view of putting yourself in a deficit or in the surplus that you're looking to be in, and then ensuring that you're maximizing, muscle protein synthesis. So when we look at protein, it's going to have a massive role in the replacement, regeneration, repair of tissue. One of them tissues being, muscle. So across a day, proteins are going to be broken down. Okay, so we've got muscle protein synthesis and muscle protein breakdown. Breakdown being the breaking down of muscle proteins. That is going to be essential to remove, well, we could just say damaged proteins, which just happens as a result of living. From a muscle protein synthesis perspective or the building of proteins, that can be, stimulated by food, which is what we're looking at when we're saying, right, we need to take in X amount of protein across a day, or through training. We've discussed training before. I think I went on a bit of a spiel about mTOR regulation, and I'm not going to do that here. And it's the balance between these two at the end of the day, which is going to determine whether we gain or lose muscle, along with training. Training adding to the muscle protein synthesis side of the equation. But without training, it's not going to be, to a high enough level. But we need to have our nutrition on point in order to get it right too. Okay. Um, yeah. Where do you want to go with that from there? But basically, that is essentially why we need to ensure that we're taking in enough protein to ensure that the synthesis is greater than the breakdown. Breakdown being higher, we're actually going to lose tissue, which can be important, especially as we diet. But also, just generally when we're looking to build muscle as well, obviously we want to be in a state of synthesis throughout it,
Yeah,
or
definitely.
not synthesis.
Yeah. Proteins obviously being made up of obviously different amino acids, ones being essential or non-essential. They are obviously what you mentioned there, specifically when it comes to physique development, is obviously mediating muscle protein synthesis and muscle protein breakdown. But there's other things that obviously protein is responsible for within the body, and not just kind of the production and degradation of skeletal tissue. So when we look at protein, we look at obviously different hormones that are involved. Obviously, when you look at like insulin, when you look at growth hormone, these are all proteins, enzymes, kinases, transporters, all these different things that are involved in like what proteins function are. It's not just about protein synthesis. There's other things that are involved when it comes to proteins. Just to keep that in perspective, it's not just about skeletal tissue. You consume protein for a lot of different things. Um, so consuming a sufficient amount of protein is essential for obviously tissue turnover. We want to make sure that we have obviously a surplus of protein so we can ensure that we have a higher um, net positive when it comes to protein balance. So we want to make sure that we are creating essentially more protein than we are breaking down, to keep it very simple. Um, so protein in itself isn't very efficient at storing. Now, obviously, we can create muscle, we can create tissue. We don't really want to use that as an energy store, but its main role is for the building up and breaking down of different tissues. That is its main function. And we want to try and make sure that we keep it at that. Now, when we experience a deficit, when we experience a dieting phase, protein's role slightly changes. It can slightly change to being that energy provider through this fancy word called gluconeogenesis, which essentially means the production or the conversion of non-carbohydrate sources to glucose. So protein being one of them.
Yep, 100%. It's obviously one of them things that it's basically as a result of depletion. as you deplete yourself of glycogen. There's just going to be less fuel. When you're in a deficit, you're going to be depleting yourself of glycogen relatively regularly. And of course, with regard to fat tissue as well. But in the state of a severe energy deficit, it will begin to be used as not even a severe deficit, but as a deficit gets longer or as you get leaner,
Mm-hmm.
it will be used more so as a fuel source. Now, there's we've obviously got this consideration then, do we increase our protein intake as a result of that? And I'm interested to hear your thoughts on that. I think there's a case to be made for it. There's also a case that you're taking away from carbohydrate,
Mm-hmm.
intake, which is the reason why you have to use protein in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so what Mikey means there is that carbohydrates are protein sparing, but also the fact that carbohydrates, when we're speaking about physique development, are the main provision for energy and obviously performance in the gym. So there's a double edged sword when it comes to that. We want to make sure that we have a sufficient amount of protein to ensure that we mitigate the total loss in muscle tissue, but we also don't want to pull away carbohydrates too much where it might affect one performance and then also that protein sparing effect. But at some point, we're going to have to make that adjustment. Now, when it comes to so what's the context? So it depends. I hate saying
Yeah,
it depends, but for let's use me for example. For me, when I'm going through this kind of more extreme dieting phase, we're going to have to sacrifice carbohydrates. There's no two ways about it. We're going to have to increase. We're going to have to increase protein to a higher extent towards the higher end of that reference range when it comes to protein, and we're going to have to decrease carbohydrates in order to create that energy deficit. That might not be the case for, let's say, a middle-aged man who's looking to lose excess body fat and to improve his body composition and health as a whole. We probably don't need to give him as much carbohydrate or as much protein relative to carbohydrates.
yeah. I just want to pull back one step and say, Jack, how much protein should I take in a day?
You,
Yeah, that's the question. No, I'm only
much do
messing
you
with
weigh?
like exactly. That's where I was gonna go with it. So when it comes to protein intake, we basically have been discussing the fact that Jack meant from that reference point that he was at, having to go even higher than that at some point. There's a psychological or component to that too, which we'll discuss. But basically, for me, where I stand with things is I take a person's body weight, and this is my default, and it's just around 2 grams per kilogram of body weight being the point that where I want to be. So if I'm working with a 100 kilogram individual, we're looking at 200 grams of protein per day. Now it's not exactly that. I actually prefer working with a range with most individuals, rather than have this yes we hit it or no we didn't hit it kind of mentality. This all it can lead into an all or nothing kind of approach, which is associated with more perfectionism. Actually, a point I didn't mention at the start. We can get to that later if you want. But I'll set a range for the client, and it might be for that client 190 to 210 grams of protein. Law of average, they're probably hopefully hitting in and around 200 grams per day. Are they going to miss out on anything from being as low as 190? I'm just not so sure that there's enough sufficient evidence to suggest that that's going to be the making or breaking of that individual, and it's adding to their ability to be adherent through the process. So 2 grams per kilogram of body weight is kind of like my default, but there's reasons why that might be higher, or you could even be that lower. So in a dieting phase, protein. One of the considerations for protein is that it can increase satiety depending on the source that you have. But as a general rule, protein will increase satiety, which means it will just help keep you fuller for longer or more satisfied with what you're having. Um, so in a dieting phase, that's obviously going to be a really nice consideration, because if you're fuller for longer, you're less likely to deal with as many maybe hunger issues. So maybe bringing your protein as high as maybe 2.5, 3 grams per kilogram of body weight is cool. toward the end of yours, Jack, I'm not really sure. I've never worked with any bodybuilders, but I've seen research that suggests as high as 3.4 grams being efficacious for
Hmm.
bodybuilders as they get extremely lean. Because obviously you would like to, we could go down the whole lean body mass route, but again, most people won't be able to, track that well. So 2 grams per kilogram of body weight is my kind of general point, and then we may raise that higher. One for satiety, and two for what we mentioned with regard to the fact that protein could be used more so as a fuel source. So to help mitigate that, that's a theoretical consideration there too. Would I go lower than 2 grams? I think that I like 2 grams being the safety point, but if I'm working with an individual in a surplus, we know that even less of that may be used as a fuel source, and the difference from 1.6 to 2 grams seems to be pretty negligible
Hmm.
from the research. So again, these are things that you, to a degree, you have to kind of look at the research and kind of just take that as what it is, because you can't possibly work with that individual at 2 or 1.6 grams and go, you know, you can't compare it to them perfectly.
Yeah, generally that's pretty spot on. There's a few situations where I wouldn't go 2 grams, and you like different situations, different contexts. Like if I have someone who's 100 kilos, but obviously he's carrying a lot less body fat, is like, or sorry, a lot less lean tissue, a lot of body fat, hasn't really ate a lot of protein in the past previously, they will probably struggle to get 2 grams in initially. I will probably start them off at 1.6. Like if someone's come to me at 100 kilos, high level of body fat, not a lot of lean tissue, hasn't really managed nutrition in the past, definitely hasn't eaten enough protein, I would probably start them off at 1.6 and work my way up based on how they progress. The kind of other side to that coin is if someone's coming to me or has been with me and they're moving into a surplus or a prolonged improvement phase, I will gradually bring that protein intake back. I've used 1.6 to 1.8 grams while escalating carbohydrates and escalating fat, total carbohydrate and fat intake for the day. One, because it's not necessary to have that much protein, and two, we can focus on their appetite towards carbohydrates and fat and not being too full from eating too much protein, which is
Yeah,
unnecessary.
yeah, exactly. And that probably leads me to a point where it's like, what happens if you eat too much protein?
Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
Well,
you know, yeah,
that's a minefield. Like that again, trying to like go through that again. If you don't have any, like if you do not have any pre-existing kidney issues, you should like there's nothing that's going to happen to you. Really, you might initially in the short term probably have really bad digestive issues. If you're having a lot of protein, a lot of like fibrous meat, you will probably run into the issues of digestion first, rather than kind of the long term consequence of
yeah,
potential renal health. Um,
yeah,
but I think that thing in itself, I think, is a big key variable that prevents people from gaining weight is having too much protein and that kind of getting in the way of their appetite. So I think that one thing I've noticed in the past myself going through that as a younger teenager, like thinking I need to put on more weight, I need to eat more protein, whereas it's not actually the case. So we would probably want to reduce that protein intake and start to escalate carbohydrates and fat.
yeah, exactly. And look, the simple way I explain this to my clients is once you've reached the whatever I've set in place for them, the 2 grams per kilogram of body weight or whatever it is, it's like it's probably not going to have any further benefit for you. So why not put them to fuel sources which can benefit you? If we're having an extra 50 grams of carbs, could that influence performance or recovery? Probably.
Hmm. Hmm.
That's the way I mean, it's just like we could be taken away from performance a little bit here, and especially if someone's in a dieting phase where it's already restricted. We're like, please just take in more carbohydrates so you can, you know, stay on top of training performance and recovery as well as possible. And that usually tends to move the needle quite a bit. So I tend to, when you put it like that to an individual, it tends to work quite well.
Yeah. When it comes to obviously the sources of protein, um, I don't really want to get down the rabbit hole of like vegetarian, veganism, stuff like that, trying to work around a
Yeah.
case study like that. That can be a bit awkward. Obviously, ideally, we want to choose protein sources from animal-based, high biological value source protein, so we can ensure that we have a wide spectrum of amino acids, specifically having a high amount of leucine with that meal or in isolation, so we can make sure that we are maximally stimulating muscle protein synthesis to keep it very simple, very plain. Leucine being one of the key essential amino acids for this signaling process, to kind of start or kickstart not amino acid, um, muscle protein synthesis. Now
Yeah,
we can go down the rabbit hole of leucine, but I think that just puts it nicely there.
for sure, for sure. Anything else you want to mention on protein?
Um,
Do
just
you
some
need it?
simple key takeaways, like in terms of the reference range between 1.6 and 2.4. Again, there's outliers there, but that's just the reference range. Per meal, you are looking at a minimum of like 20 grams of high biological value source protein, and that can vary up until, again, depending on your needs, like it can go up to like 50 or 60 grams per meal. So there's that kind of window, but having at least a minimum, like a bare minimum of 20 grams, depending on the individual, that is what is necessary in order to kind of stimulate or maximally stimulate muscle protein synthesis.
And it's, as you said, the bigger the individual you're working with, the more muscle mass there, the greater that requirement is going to be. I had a consideration for this around when we chat about nutrient timing, so I'll probably leave that for there.
Yeah,
I think you've covered that relatively well, and there's nothing more beneficial about having a protein shake
yeah,
relative to having other high quality protein sources.
yeah,
Just it's an important. Like sometimes clients ask me, "Do I need to buy protein?" It's like, well, just something magic about it. It's just another protein source, a pretty high quality protein source at that, and that will help you to reach your goals. Or in my case, I like putting them in oats and I like
yeah,
putting them in basically,
yeah. Main thing there is convenience and cost of effectiveness. Like, them two things in itself, like, you get the most bang for your buck, and it's very convenient. So if people are having issues with their protein, or they're trying to make sure, or they're on a budget, again, you can't go wrong with that. Now, again, it's not an essential thing, but it does help.
Yeah, for sure. Carbohydrates, we chat about them.
Carbohydrates, yeah. Do you want to kickstart it? Do you want me to kickstart it, or how do you want to approach it?
I guess the problem with carbohydrates. So remember, I mentioned the problem about protein. I think about carbohydrates, it's hopefully mostly in the past, but it's the fact that people think that carbohydrates are what make you fat, um, or that sugar is like demonized. In reality, it's neither of them things which will make you fat. It's the fact that you tend to have if we're having a high carbohydrate diet and you're eating foods which are more hyper palatable, you'll just tend to eat more of them. So it's a lot easier to consume 1,000 grams of carbohydrates, which will place most people in surplus, than it is to consume 1,000 grams of protein per day.
Yeah,
And it's, that's sort of a consideration when we look at carbohydrates. Obviously there's some individuals who will be maybe keto or whatever, but as a general rule, it's going to be our primary fuel source. So it's going to be the thing that helps drive training the most. Actually, one of the things that I actually preface this whole conversation with regard to macronutrients is, are they essential? Or the fact that macronutrients are essential, and you'll often hear, that you actually don't necessarily need carbohydrates, so they're maybe not essential in some terms. But the way I would look at it is, it's not essential to keep living, but maybe to thrive and to perform at the best ability. In that case, they then become quite essential over time. Um, would you agree?
definitely. Yeah, it's kind of like the whole survival, thrive versus thrive. Like, again, like when it comes to body composition, if you're trying to maximize physique development, you need carbohydrates. There's no if or buts. Like, if I had to give one absolute, that is one thing. Like, if you ever have, like, I don't know if people have experienced what no carbohydrates is like, or have like been in that situation. But in that situation, you're thinking, "I this is essential." You will quickly change your mind in terms of like when if you've experienced a dieting phase and you're eating 50 grams of carbs a day, and you're dying pretty much. Well, you feel like you're dying. You think to yourself, carbohydrates are essential, and you will praise them till the day you die. So technically, are they essential for survival? No, but for thriving and performing at your best, absolutely. No ifs, ands, or buts. And how do I really don't know how to approach this, like the types of carbohydrates, like what do you want to kind of delve into here when it comes to that?
So I would say, if we stick with like fuel source, we'll be looking at two primary considerations there with regard to glycogen and then glucose availability.
Yeah,
Um, we're primarily looking at glycogen as providing a lot of the fuel for training,
yeah,
which is going to be it's this glycogen being the stored form of carbohydrate, which is primarily found in muscle tissue.
yeah.
Um, Up to a kilogram in really elite athletes, but none of us will be storing anywhere near that.
The
Based
average is
on
like 400, isn't it?
yeah,
Four or
400.
500 is like the average.
Yeah. When you're looking at like elite endurance runners, so this is
Yeah,
what the majority of my master's degree would have like looked at. You'll
yeah,
get top level guys holding a kilogram of glycogen, and that's just
yeah,
based on their training history and probably a genetic consideration as well, which is what led them to even getting that far in sport.
yeah,
Um, but yeah, so glycogen being the form that we're primarily looking at to drive training, which means that when we're looking at fueling for training, a lot of people look at that pre gym meal or pre meal, and in reality that's having much less of an effect than maybe we might think that it's going to have.
yeah,
um, it can help with our blood glucose levels for sure. But more so, I just find that it can help with not feeling hungry within the session as well.
yeah,
Whereas in reality, it's really what you've done in maybe the 24 hours before that, even more, that will have the role of fueling training per se.
yeah. So again, this will become more important in terms of timing. Again, relating that to timing in terms of the 24-hour period. Um, when you are in a deficit or dieting, um, when you are about to train or the lead up to training, in terms of carbohydrates, its main kind of function is to kind of maintain kind of blood glucose levels as a whole across the day. It's to obviously replenish glycogen stores. So kind of to, if you think about it in a way, when you have your post workout meal, it's essentially the pre workout meals leading up to your next session and making sure that you have the highest amount of glycogen stored prior to the following session. So we're looking at it in a short term, kind of the contribution to blood glucose, and then as a whole across the day, its contribution to kind of creating more glycogen and that whole process.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And then obviously we mentioned about its protein sparing effects.
Yeah,
Um, so don't want to go down this rabbit hole, right? I'll just say this briefly. This is. Do you want to hear some torture?
okay.
Uh, okay, so we had the guy we had for integrative physiology, the lecturer we had, amazing, like world renowned lecture. But one of the studies he did, like in the 90s, I presume, because that's where all of the studies are from, was single legged knee extension. So
Yeah,
leg extensions for 90 minutes.
90
90,
minutes
90 minutes of knee
non-stop,
extension. Okay, yeah,
continuous.
yeah. So the load was quite low, as you can imagine,
Yeah,
but knee extension work. The difference between so there was two trials. In one, the leg was had a normal level of glycogen. Okay, so there was
yeah,
normal glycogen levels. So whatever for that athlete was considered to be normal. And then they did it again, I presume. I can't remember the exact ins and outs of the study, but they did it again where the leg was depleted of glycogen, okay? So what they found was that there was a 9 to 20% or 9 to 20 fold increase in muscle protein breakdown in the normal leg. So this is
Right.
where I'm going, okay? In the normal leg. And there was like a 3 times that increase in muscle protein breakdown in the depleted leg, which just
Right.
goes to the impact of not having enough glycogen
Yeah.
available on protein breakdown, which obviously impacts that protein equation that we talked about earlier with regard to protein, with the protein turnover. So basically, from being depleted in glycogen, what began to be used as the fuel source was protein.
Yeah.
So a much larger amount of muscle protein breakdown occurring, which obviously just that protein turnover equation so much. So it's just highlighting the impact of having that glycogen available there where possible to spare protein.
Yeah. Yeah, I would not like to be part of that study. I wonder if like they knew what they're getting into and they were like, yeah, I'll do that. Like some just psycho, just like, yeah, I'll do that knee extension for
I've
90 minutes.
I've got a
Um,
I've got a picture of it. It just looks brutal. Like it's
yeah,
just lots to see.
I find
But
it
yeah,
like I find it like the studies where they take biopsies that really freaks me out. Like reading studies of like how they do the knee extension and they will take biopsies and
yeah,
they'll like do obviously further knee extension. I'm like, how the hell can you keep doing that after it's been like taking a piece of your muscle out of your leg? I'm like, oh my god, like into like the like looks like their rec fem or their you actually usually it's their vas lateralis, isn't it? It's usually
yeah. It's
that
usually
area of their quad.
yeah.
Yeah.
I saw a couple of them being done last year in Liverpool. So
God.
I've seen them being done, and yeah, they're it's weird just seeing the muscle on like a dish, is a petri dish, I think, just sitting there like, oh wow. Um, yeah. So look,
Yeah.
I was asked to do it, and I was like, no, I'm not doing it.
No.
I'm putting too much into these games. I'm not letting you take
Yeah, I'm
the.
all right. Not taking a
Yeah.
gram of muscle off me.
Well, I spent 6 months with this. From, I guess, a body composition point of view, I think is where we should, we just discussed the impact on performance. Um, from a body composition perspective, when it comes to carbohydrates and fat, they're going to have a much smaller role than, or the precise, distribution of them will have a much smaller role than the role of protein on body composition. So get your protein to a place, then you can kind of mess around with carbohydrates and fat.
Yeah.
Um, I have a preference to keep carbohydrates as high as possible whilst hitting some minimal intakes with regard to fat intake,
Yeah.
just so that we stay on top of performance as much as possible, whether you're in a surplus or in a deficit. Because if we can keep carbohydrates as high, we might be having a positive impact upon performance, which, whilst in the short term, as I said, body composition isn't really altered by these things. Um, in the long term, having a higher level of performance, maybe as a result of having a higher carbohydrate intake, might. And I always have to say might because I don't know. I don't get the opportunity to bring the same person through the two different protocols. So
Yeah.
I'm going on theoretical considerations. Might be able to improve body composition in a much longer kind of phase.
Yeah. I would always start with protein, then fat, and then whatever's left over in carbohydrates personally. I wouldn't like to see anyone outside of the fact if they're doing an extreme dieting phase, contest prep, photo shoot, not to go anywhere past kind of zero point 0.5 um, times their body weight in fat.
That's
That
it.
is kind of like the lowest. I'd probably set that as the lowest. Based off preference, I might go a bit higher. If they like to have a little bit more fat in their diet, I'll go a little bit higher. Um, Again, on the other end of that spectrum, if they're in a surplus, I wouldn't want to push fat too high unless they can tolerate it very well. The biggest consideration there being their digestion, and having a lot of fat with carbohydrates in a meal can potentially affect, obviously, gastric emptying and their digestion. So that's where we can kind of run the risk of having too much fat in their diet in a surplus. but obviously enough fat to support the essential needs that fat provides, not just as energy provision, but other things as well.
Yeah, I'm at that 0.5 gram as well per kilogram of body weight range for fat as the minimum. I like it to be between that and 1 gram as a general rule.
Yeah, yeah,
If it's much higher, I tend to be like, I want to see food quality again. Can you just send me over a few
yeah.
diaries there, just assess food quality? Because I know myself, when I have my higher fat days, I've generally had bagels and Biscoff nearly for most meals.
Bagels and Biscoff. That's a good combo. Bagels and
Yeah,
Biscoff.
sorry for putting that in your head.
Oh yeah, I'm like, okay, now I can't have bagels. I don't have any more bagels left in my diet. Never mind Biscoff. Biscoff is that's gone ages ago. But I think when it comes to that pyramid, just to kind of go back a little bit, food quality. I don't think that's put in there enough. I think macronutrients and food quality go hand in hand, and I think then that kind of leads into or bleeds into micronutrients. I
Yeah,
think that perspective on right, I have my calories, I hit my protein, I can do pretty much anything I like with carbohydrates and fat. That's not kind of the approach that I would take. Like we can be flexible, but flexible with the mindset of your food quality has to be good. It has to be in order for you to perform the way you want to perform from a digestion standpoint, from a micronutrition standpoint, from a hunger level or satiation standpoint. Food quality has to come hand in hand with micronutrition and hitting your macros, whatever that kind of way in which you perceive that. And that can be pretty much like people can butcher that and they don't really understand why they're not making progress. Now, it's not a case of that they're not being accurate, is that it can indirectly affect progress in terms of digestion, how they feel, their overall well being, and then a lack of micronutrition, and then as well as that, their satiation isn't that great, and that can lead to higher hunger levels and potentially overeating unconsciously, maybe, or consciously, depending on what they kind of fess up to. So I think food quality and macronutrients in that hierarchy go hand in hand.
absolutely, 100%. Like it's okay. I was gonna come to this. I will come to at the end to put it all together. But basically have like a daily box ticker exercise, which is like the five tenets that I'm like, these things need to be ticked off with regard to nutrition. One of them being to have more, 80% of your food being whole, less processed foods, high quality foods, and ensure just using high quality options. And of course, we're going to bleed micronutrients into that now, which are probably, they're still a consideration with regard to food quality as well. And probably have a large role in food quality too, from the point of view of, I don't know, whether you're looking at like where you get a lot of micronutrition from your fruits and your vegetables, for example. So that all blends in together in my head when we're looking at. I probably have macros and micros, and food quality is just like around and things, you know.
Yeah. Um, Variety is going to be the biggest one there when it comes to managing micronutrition. Obviously, we can be that a little bit more detailed in terms of the food choices and how they will impact micronutrition. This is only really a concern in either, again, the two ends of the spectrum being an aggressive dieting phase where energy availability is very low, or you're pushing food very, very high where you have a high amount of energy availability and you might miss out on a few things because you're trying to push calories and you might not be able to kind of get the micronutrition from fruits and vegetables. I'd hope anyway you try and keep in fruits and vegetables, but at a certain point to the extreme of pushing food, you might miss out, and that's where either supplementation has to come in, or we're going to have to structure food a bit better.
Yeah, and there's probably people thinking, if you've got more food, how are you struggling to get your fruit and veg in? But it's just from the point of view of they tend to not be that calorie dense
Hmm.
or have that much calories relative to how maybe full they'll make you feel. and as a result of that, you're looking at, from a food selection point of view, maybe not doing that, maybe having foods that won't keep you as full all of the time, so that you can get that next meal in. So I believe that's where you're kind of coming from with that. Is it?
Yeah, like if you've properly done an improvement phase, you will understand this. Like if you are constantly eating, let's say, excess of 4,000 calories, like 4,000 calories at the end of a dieting phase for someone might be like easy, grand, no problem. Do that for 6 months consistently. You're not gonna have a fun time. You're gonna hate food. And again, that's the extreme of like I'm trying to push body weight. I'm trying to maximize physique development for bodybuilding, for a photo shoot, or just you want to build as much muscle as possible. You're going to have to push things a little bit harder. And to the extremes, you're going to have issues that will arise when it comes to, for example, micronutrition and falling behind on fruit and veg intake, because the last thing you want to do is eat a fruit and vegetable because you're eating 700, 800 grams of carbohydrates per
Yeah,
day, every day, and that can be very difficult. Um, Not saying it can be done, can't be done. It's just difficult, and you have to be a little bit more strategic with food choice, meal timing, and supplementation.
yeah, for sure. Just to define it, so micronutrition. Uh, so when we looked at macros, we're saying that they're nutrients required in larger amounts in the diet that provided energy. So basically, with micros, we're saying that they're required in smaller amounts, and the main difference being that they won't provide energy, but they're going to be essential for maybe for in the ability to use energy. They're going to be essential for normal physiological function, and just overall health and well being. Going to be very important.
Yeah,
Um, sorry. After that, we're really looking at to a large degree, it's like vitamins and minerals. They're going to make up a lot of our micronutrition, and trying to consider them. Now, I've went down a rabbit hole before of learning off every vitamin, every mineral,
yeah,
all of their functions, the sources, the RDAs, the adequate intakes for the whatever it is, and at the end of it, I was like, right, what have I actually changed within what I'm actually doing here? And
yeah,
nothing changed, to be honest with you. You know, if you know that you require more of a vitamin or a certain mineral, you're going to then supplement for that. If you get some tests done to suggest that. But for a lot of people, what they will get from learning each and every one of them off by heart or something is just the return on investment is just so minimal. So I don't think it's worth learning off every one of them. Where do you fall with that?
yeah. Again, specific circumstances when it comes to certain individuals. So again, like if someone comes to me and they're a vegetarian or a vegan, or um, they have, or let's say it's a female, and I have some feedback on maybe blood work, or like feedback from their doctor, or their other source of information, a nutritionist. They say that they need more calcium, or more iron, or more vitamin D, or more magnesium. There might be certain circumstances where we would prioritize foods that are higher in iron, higher in calcium, higher in magnesium, etc. And so certain specific circumstances, I always try and take a food first approach, and then from there see if it's not feasible. Right, what can we do from a supplement standpoint? When it comes to micronutrition, like again, like I said, variety is the key there in terms of food sources. And then when it comes to fruit and veg, different colors, textures, etc., if we do that, we're pretty much covering the basis. If you're in a dieting phase and you're in a prolonged dieting phase, um, we could make the argument of a good multivitamin and like multi mineral, um, to ensure that we're not running into any deficiencies and that we're ticking the boxes there. If we are going into a surplus, we could do the same. If we track things and we notice that certain areas are falling behind, we can supplement with them as well. but it's on a case by case basis. But using reference points when it comes to variety of foods, different colors, textures when it comes to vegetables and fruit. If you want to be really kind of going over with a fine tooth comb, you could track everything when it comes to your veg, your fruit, obviously your daily intake, and put it into Chronometer. I like to use Chronometer now because MyFitnessPal has decided to make you pay for most of their stuff now. So I like to use Chronometer, or you can use MyFitnessPal if you pay for it, and see where you come up short when it comes to micronutrition. And for you as an individual, if you have certain things you need to focus on, anyway, like if you have, like for example, one of my clients got a DEXA done as part of her kind of health check, is for like insurance, and she got a DEXA done to kind of see her Z score when it comes to bone mineral density, and it was on the lower end of normal. Now she resistance trains, she eats a very varied diet. But right now it's focusing on calcium, it's focusing on vitamin D, it's focusing on these areas that can hopefully bring up this alongside obviously resistance training. So that's just one example that we can focus on nutrition, like increasing foods that have higher amounts of calcium, vitamin D, and to help with bone mineral density. She always eats a high protein diet anyway, so that's just one consideration. It could have been, again, it was still in normal, but I just wanted to make sure, like, right, okay, the next time we do this, I would like to see this a bit higher because this individual is in her late 40s. So it's important to make sure that she has good bone mineral density. So that's one example.
Yeah, no, perfect. And I fall like right in line with that with regard to my recommendations too. It's literally just eat predominantly whole foods. Ensure that you're eating fruit and vegetables regularly. Maybe your 5 a day is too generic of a recommendation there. I like 2 to 3 pieces or servings per 1,000 calories as a general rule.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, as we're getting higher, I'm not pushing it too much there, but 2 to 3 per 1,000 calorie, 4 to 6 being the average there for someone on 2,000 calories. I think that's a good place to be. I'm just looking at my notes on that, and then just think colors
Yeah.
equal variety. So we're literally again following the line there pretty much. Yeah, then other than that, man, I think we'll move on to nutrient timing. So we're moving again up the pyramid, which obviously, as we move up the pyramid, we're moving to things that won't have as much of an impact as the things below. So still need to ensure that them things, and I think the first 3 that we've looked at there are going to have the largest impact upon all outcomes. Okay. After that, with nutrient timing, it's great to be able to sit at the dinner table and explain to your family why you're having exactly everything when you're having it.
Yeah.
It's real sexy, but in reality, it doesn't have as much of an impact as any of the other things. So don't miss the forest for the trees. Ensure that you've got your calories, your macronutrients, and your micros relatively well taken care of, and then start to worry about nutrient timing.
Yeah. Yeah, the
Um,
biggest consideration for meal timing will be protein throughout the day. That's going to be the biggest one, as well as calories throughout the day as well. So not just eating all your calories, which subsequently will be protein, carbohydrates, and fat, but having it spaced out throughout the day. And with regards to your training day, prioritizing it around the training window, or kind of in that time where before you train, during your training, and after your training. On your rest days, it can just be just spread out as normal in terms of the amount of protein, the amount of carbohydrates, and the amount of fat. You can adjust it kind of whatever way you prefer. If you're in a dieting phase and you would prefer having carbohydrates a bit later on in the day because that helps with adherence and it helps with your satiation because you're hungrier towards the end of the day, do that. But again, this becomes more important when you're at the extremes of either a dieting phase and in a surplus. That's where things become a little bit more important when it comes to nutrient timing. So when it comes
yeah,
to protein feedings, if we look at kind of what is, I hate to use the word optimal, but like when it comes to protein throughout the day, ideally you would want to try and space protein at least 4 times throughout the day. 3 to 4 times throughout the day. I would like to see four personally, especially if you have a high amount of protein. And for me, I have to space it 5 to 6 times because of the amount of protein that I consume throughout the day. And for me as a bodybuilder. So that would be the first thing. Do you have something to add? I kind of just went into it. I didn't really actually ask if you wanted to start first, but that's kind of where I'm at initially.
Yeah, yeah, I'm in the same kind of boat as you there with regard to that. I guess, even meal frequency itself, anywhere from 3 to 6 is going to be fine, but I have a bias for four like you. It's mostly just an internal bias that I've built,
Yeah.
but I do feel four is a nice lower end to be. I think whilst the research will show that like anywhere from 3 to 6, you're going to get the same results really. I think four is a nice, place to be to start off with from general meals, and obviously within them, obviously you're going to have all your protein servings. A huge consideration for where you are, because 3 or 6 meals is quite it's a big range, is availability. So what we mentioned at the start of the podcast, and there's no point telling someone to have 6 meals a day if they're working an 18-hour shift during that day. It's just not a possible thing that they might be able to do. If we've got someone who's available, and able to 4, 5, 6 meals, brilliant. If we've got someone who can only have three in, I will definitely say that is absolutely fine. It's absolutely fine if 3 meals is what you can do, and then it falls in line with your personal preference. I'm all well and good for that. And then after that, it's obviously that's just meal frequency. Then it's the timing of the nutrients across the day, which you obviously mentioned about protein itself. We're looking to spread them out. Them meals that we've discussed, the 3 to 6, 4 to 6 meals per day, with regard to protein servings, and them meals, we can obviously combine that to match. And you're looking at having them 3 to 5 hours apart from each other. So we're distributing that protein relatively regularly in order to stimulate muscle protein synthesis regularly. So it's what I discussed earlier. And if we can stimulate muscle protein synthesis within 3 to 5 hours, any earlier than that, we may not be able to, get as much from it as we could if our protein servings are too close together. Whereas if we can spread it out, we may be able to have a better, a nicer impact upon things there. You mentioned earlier with regard to protein and ensuring that there's a minimal of 20 grams within them servings. I like to, 20 is what I come in at. I like to set the barrier a little bit higher for clients, so that if they fall back, they're falling back to 20 rather than falling back to 15, whatever. So I might set it at 30 to say to them, but really I'm happy with 20. And then the only other real consideration is around the training window. So 1 to 2 hours either side of the training window is generally a good shout too.
Yeah. In terms of protein, that's pretty much, don't need to really say anything else other than that. There was one thing, but I completely forgot about it, what you mentioned there. Doesn't matter. If it was important, I would have remembered it. When it comes to timing of carbohydrates and fat, again, this is less of importance, but still important nevertheless in terms of spacing out throughout the day. On a training day specifically, carbohydrates being the main kind of provision for energy when it comes to the exercise that we are doing in the gym. So we want to make sure we're prioritizing carbohydrates around that training window. So a decent percentage of carbohydrates being focused around the pre, intra, and post workout. If you are using an intra, in that case. So there's no definitive way in which I can say how to space it out, but I don't really know how. Like when it comes to carbohydrates, we just want to make sure. I'd say, I don't know if 50% is a way in which I can give an objective metric to give around the training window, but a decent bit of it is going to be around the training window. And then depending on your situation and your goals, you will then delegate the rest of the carbohydrates accordingly. What is your take and your feedback on that? There's just so many different contexts, so I don't really know how to say a definitive answer.
Yeah, so if we look at pre-training, the results are relatively mixed with regard to their impact on muscle building. But if there was to be an impact, I think it would be that there would be an improvement in outcome. So I don't think that, placing more of your carbohydrates, or a good chunk of your carbohydrates in that pre-training window, and so long as it's not too much that's going to take away from the session, I think it's generally a good thing, or could be a good thing. And then, considerations for after, I'm similar in that once we're getting around 50% around that window where possible. Obviously, if you're on 1,000 calories, it mightn't be as achievable, or 1,000 grams of carbohydrate, it might not be as achievable to get 50% around it. But I try not to allow my clients to get too caught up in it. I'll say, look, just aim for this. Realistically, what's fueling the session is really from the day before, as we've discussed with regard to glycogen and the repletion of that fuel source. So long as you're not training twice per day or whatever, it's got to be repleted in time for the next session again. So there's not really, people are like, I need to get my carbohydrates in the 2 hours after in order to replete for my next session. But in reality, there's actually two considerations there. By the time your next session comes around, plus 24 hours, it's going to be relatively well repleted with regard to glycogen. And the second thing is that you're probably not going to be training that muscle group within that window anyway, because we're going to be training somewhere else. So in reality, I don't think that it's maybe as important as some people consider, probably more important than others, which is a terrible way to put it. But 50% of carbohydrates in and around that window is probably a nice rule on average. But more important if you're dieting, and the more severe that diet is, or the longer that it's been going on, or in maybe other sports which may be more glycolytically demanding, or you've got games, maybe multiple games a day, or get the days back to back, it's probably more important there. Fiber as well, just maybe trying to keep that a little bit lower for some. This is individual specific, but keeping that a little bit lower around that window too can be helpful, just from the point of view of if you find digestion being an issue, keeping it a little bit lower can be helpful. And it's the same idea with fat then.
Yeah, I was going to say, obviously, trying to move fat away from probably the pre and post session as much as possible. A few grams here and there isn't going to be too bad, but fat slowing down digestion, or kind of slowing gastric emptying, that can obviously affect digestion prior to the session, which can throw things off, and then after the session, that can slightly throw things off, especially when you're pushing food and food's a bit higher. So trying to maybe keep fats outside or away pretty much from the training session, and then trying to focus carbohydrates around the training session, as a simple rule of thumb.
Yeah, because if you've got like much longer sessions, you might actually want to slow down digestion a little bit, for them or if you find like yourself going a little bit more hypoglycemic within the session as well, there might be considerations around that. But again, we're not going into them specifics here. They're obviously very individual situation specific considerations there, but that's kind of where I am, man, with regard to nutrient timing.
Without trying to go into the nuances with regards to that. Do you want to wrap it up with supplements?
Supplementation, you got to have a good reason why you're actually taking a supplement. I think that's the most important thing. That you're not just taking it because your friend is taking it, or you've seen on, TikTok is the thing now, isn't it? That's just like, I'm not sure how avidly you follow TikTok, but when it comes to fitness TikTok, I tend to press the not interested button whenever it comes up there, because I really, it's one of them things that I really don't enjoy. But it's like you see an individual that's like, I took creatine for 5 weeks and this is what happened, and it's like 4-year transformation.
The short form content when it comes to supplements is mad. I don't have TikTok because I just think I had it for maybe like 2 weeks, and I was like, I have to delete this because it's taken away my time and it's burning brain cells looking at it. Obviously, there's going to be some decent content out there, funny
Yeah.
entertainment, some decent kind of informative stuff, but that stuff just, I literally remember spending an hour just watching shit, and I just, hour gone. I'm like, I haven't done any work, and I was like, this is getting deleted. But yeah, obviously that kind of clickbaity kind of title when it comes to certain supplements, because it's this magic thing that's going to just elevate your kind of muscle building potential, and they use nice kind of fancy buzzwords to draw you in and all that crack. So um yeah, with supplements, it's very hard. Like the angle of supplements, it's a very difficult one to go down. Ones that are going to be beneficial when it comes to the different areas or aspects, when it comes to performance, or when it comes to overall health, or body composition, or immune function, or the list goes on. There's different sleep, like that could indirectly help with performance, like all this kind of stuff. But if we're specifically talking about performance, there obviously isn't a lot of supplements out there to help directly with performance. Specifically, when we talk about like resistance training in itself, and not going down the rabbit hole of endurance, because that's not the focus. Um, like the biggest two that are the most widely researched, that have been beaten to death, is caffeine and creatine. They're the biggest two when it comes to elevating performance, when it comes to resistance training. And there's too many research studies to obviously correlate that. So yeah, this is one where I kind of left out my preparation, because I'm like, what do I talk about? So up until
Yeah.
now, I've prepared, but now I'm like, what do I talk about with regards to
Yeah.
supplements?
I think the thing is with supplementation, it's in the word. It's there to supplement. It's not there to be like the main thing with the nutritional program. It's there to help you to either achieve a healthy baseline of a certain, whatever it is, vitamin, mineral, whatever it is that we're looking to achieve the healthy baseline for, or to reach a level of a nutrient within your body that you otherwise would not. Creatine being an example of that. When we're looking at supplementation, there's four things that we want to look at, okay? And I've just pulled this up here. The first being its effectiveness. So, what effect does it have? Or does it even have an effect? So that's the first thing that we want to consider. But then this next thing is the validity of using that supplement for us. So is that effect going to be something which is going to actually benefit us? Okay. So if we look at something like beta alanine. Okay, so beta alanine buffers has a role in buffering metabolites. Okay, um, that's its effect. But is that something that we want? And if you're looking specifically as a resistance trainee, buffering metabolites may not be a good thing, because we actually are looking to, well, one of the mechanisms behind muscle hypertrophy might be metabolite accumulation. So if we're buffering that, it could be taking away from that role. So as a result, beta alanine might not be a supplement that you would want to take if your goal is to build muscle. Although you may actually do more reps in the gym, so you actually might perform better, but maybe you're not, you know, building up as much maybe your limiting factor is no longer metabolite accumulation. And so this is something still being kind of looked at in the research, is the role of beta alanine and similar supplements which buffer, metabolites. But whilst the supplement may have an effect, is that effect actually something that you are going to benefit from for your overall goal? And then you want to consider that in line with, the overall quality of the supplements, and if it's maybe what's called, if it's got a lab analysis being done on it, or if there's proprietary blends, or proprietary blends meaning it's got multiple ingredients which you don't actually know how much of each ingredient there is. So whilst you might get the ingredient that you're looking for in a certain supplement, you don't know how much of it that there is. So again, that comes back to the quality of that ingredient. And the last thing to consider is just the return on investment. And this is what I always will look at to try and determine whether I'm, going to engage in buying a supplement. It's them four things. And is the price that you're going to pay worth the effect that you're going to get, and is that effect something that you actually want to obtain?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Um, a lot of times, most of the circumstances come down to the individual and what the individual needs are. So what you said there is perfect. In terms of what you should look for and the different areas that you should use to kind of make that decision to take that certain supplement. It's something that's very difficult to talk about and give something like objective feedback and discuss, because you have to have a context and a certain situation for like giving a case study and then going, right, this would make sense for this individual. Like you can make
Yeah,
the argument to like give someone creatine, caffeine, whey protein, a multivitamin, an omega 3, and you can make the argument, and they could benefit from it. Like them 5 things you could probably agree with taking, because they're more than likely going to have a benefit on either their performance or their health, and then that will indirectly or directly affect body composition. So
yeah.
yeah.
Main thing I'd say is just be educated, or find someone who can educate you on what you're taking. Don't just throw money at stuff.
Yeah.
Um, and if you're unsure, you can obviously go on like examine.com
Yeah.
and have a look at some stuff. So there's plenty of like free stuff there that you can have a look at. Obviously, you can sign up to a website where you get like a much more in-depth look at things, but you can get something from the free aspects of examine.com, I think. And it's just, I think it is important to ensure that you actually know what you're doing.
Yeah. Yeah. that that specific section needs a lot more context, and nuance than any of the ones we just discussed. For anyone who is looking to take a certain supplement, that one's a little bit more specific to you, but we can make the general kind of assumption that everyone could probably benefit from them 5 things that I mentioned. Um, Maybe adding a vitamin D supplement there,
Yeah,
around the time of winter. That would be the other thing as well. Like everything else, then it comes down to what's your current circumstances. Where are you coming from? Um, if you, yeah, the examples can be endless, but yeah, that's what I mean.
I think that's more or less it, man. I think that's the hierarchy that we're looking to follow. And then when I'm putting that together for an individual, when we've obviously looked at the initial section where we went through support systems, structure, being too rigid versus showing just restraint, you know, all of that kind of stuff. So once we've got that in place and we're actually setting the plan for the individual that's in front of us, and we're matching their level to and their goal to the plan. After that, it's about daily ticking the boxing of putting your calories in a good place, having a sufficient amount of protein per day, ensuring that that protein is relatively evenly spread out throughout the day into 3 to 6 servings. Allowing your carbohydrates and fats to kind of be distributed as you like and enjoy, with a consideration for having maybe a little bit more carbohydrate around the training window, a little bit less fat around the training window, ensuring that you're getting a lot of whole, less processed foods in, plenty of fruit and vegetables in, and from there, it's really just the supplementation is really just going to dot the i's across the t's.
Yeah, that's the framework in which anyway
Yeah,
me and yourself work with, and that's kind of the foundation that we work with towards an individual. And obviously everyone is different. Certain things will be prioritized over others depending on the individual. And I think that kind of wraps things up really nicely.
yeah. It was interesting that we basically do the same things.
Hmm. Yeah. Pretty much, yeah. And then the other specific things, like different specific approaches and stuff, are slightly different. Yeah. Um, Actually, for some reason, I remember mentioning it to you in the gym during a session, that for my clients that I give them homework to do, and I actually say the word homework. Have you used that since?
I've been using it, and I've had to use it a bit less. I must say crop of individuals that I'm working with now are really good, like really good. I'm really content with. Maybe it's, I don't know if it's the information that I'm putting out at the minute or how it's been received, but I've got really good clients. But where required, I use the word homework, and I've yeah, people kind of double look. It's like, what? I have to do what? It's like,
Yeah.
yeah, go watch that video that I have on. So I'll have a full nutrition lecture series, and I might go watch one because I might ask a certain question on the supplements, and it's like, here's your homework for the week. Go watch the supplements video.
Yeah. Yeah. I just, for some reason, I remember that, and it does help, um, just to get things done when it comes to clients, to making sure they do that, because it is important. Um, yeah, that was a good chat. Wraps things up. I thought we were going to go into more detail, but I'm glad we didn't because of the time. It's, like I said, over 2 hours now, so yeah, sums things up very nicely in terms of the framework. Maybe doing a video or a podcast on maybe a specific topic for maybe further detail or nuance when it comes to protein, carbohydrates, calories, whatever. That'd be cool.
We can run through the Krebs cycle if you want sometime.
Oh yeah, glycolysis, Krebs cycle, electron transport chain.
Yeah,
Yeah, that sounds very interesting. I'd say you get a lot of viewers on.
I don't think too many people are interested in
Yeah,
that.
no, definitely not. Um, cool. We wrap it up there.
All right, guys. So thank you very much for tuning in. Hopefully, you've got a lot from this. I definitely enjoyed the chat. It's good to see myself and Jack, basically on the same hymn sheet in a lot of places. Whilst our methods may differ in some other places, but yeah, no, that's it wrapped up now, and I hope to see you guys soon again. Thank you.